The orchard was started here by the Russians in 1814. They had spent the first 2 years, they arrived in 1812, and they built their stockades and set up their fort. And then they came up here and started their orchard. They brought a peach tree, which they planted behind me in 1814. So the orchard is, at this point, just a little over 200 years old. The Russians collected plant materials from San Francisco, Peru, and from some of the missions, and planted a lot of different kinds of trees here at the orchard. 8 of those trees were a tree called Capelin Cherries, and we have a record of them having been shipped from the mission at Santa Cruz as very small plants, brought up here and planted in the orchard. Capelin cherries are a variety of cherry from Central and South America. The fruit is not like the cherry you would expect to find. It's quite small and it's used for flavoring. These trees are supposed to live for 250 years. Of the 8, we now have 2 1/4 left, and that's why we are working with Keith from the National Park Service and our volunteers to try to rejuvenate these very old trees.
We preserve historic orchards because they represent a tangible link to the past. Orchard trees are fairly durable features in the landscape. They tell us who was here before us, what their values were, what kinds of fruits they grew, what they ate, and it can speak to a lot about the history of trade, especially the trees behind us here at Fort Ross State Park. Our goal today is several-fold. We want to maintain the historic character and the traditional shape of the trees, but without damaging them or taking out too much material. They have a lot of character, but they've also been, relatively neglected over the years. And so we're basically just pruning today to get them back into shape, into a stable and attractive condition. What a tree wants to do is seek light, so it grows on top of itself, interior growth that gets shaded out and is no longer advantageous to the tree ends up dying. That dead twiggy growth is really doing nothing for the tree structurally or aesthetically, and that takes more time than you might think to get all the dead twigs out, but it really improves the look of the tree, but also from a tree health perspective, it lets more air and sunlight into the interior of the tree. So that's important just to mitigate disease, moistness inside the canopy of the tree. It looks like it's putting off fairly decent growth each year for its age. A younger tree would, of course, put off much more vigorous growth, but I think that cleaning this tree up, it'll probably just be happier.
Good.
And look better. A fruit tree should have some sort of symmetry and structure that facilitates growth and picking. Sometimes you'll have vacancies in the canopy. Well, that's an opportunity to take a small branch and train it and reestablish that space, let it fill that space. Here today we've got these orchard ladders. I call them tripod ladders as well. The beauty of the orchard tripod ladders is that you can position it in such a way that it's stable and safe. If you have a tall enough ladder, you can slide the third leg up and over branches. Suppose I wanted to get over here. As I ascend, give it a little shake each time, just make sure it's fairly stable. You really want to be careful about overextending the power of your wrist with these hand pruners. This, I think, qualifies as just a little too big and too dead and woody to cut through. So I'm going to get out my pruning saw. So you may notice I'm holding the dead part that I'm cutting off, basically just to stabilize it, because if I didn't, I wouldn't get any traction with the blades. Sometimes when you get pruning with a saw, there's so much momentum and you're bearing down on the wood, it's easy to cut through suddenly and slip. What we're doing here is really just the first pass of what I think are several that this tree probably needs. I'm trying to be judicious about taking too much living material this first pass. Sometimes I will just scratch the outer bark to see if I see greenery or not, just to see if it's alive or not. Beginning to see some progress. You can nip away for days, especially when you start at the tips. You feel like you're not getting anywhere, but very soon we're going to kind of break through this cluster of twigs and you'll be able to see the branch structure, and the branches will sort of have their independent position in space. You know, honestly, it'll probably look thin once you're done, but after a few seasons, it'll fill in nicely and not be so dense. Some of these twigs are so punky, you don't even need to prune them, I feel. You just kind of brush them off. As we clear out all this material, I'm starting to be able to see through the canopy, which is nice. Some of these branches kind of wind through and thread their way through. If you're taking out large branches that are bound up and crossed and twisted through other material, it's tempting to want to just grab the cut piece and pull it on through, but I would caution you to just make sure you're not going to break other branches in the process. Sometimes I find it easier to take it down in pieces and then pull it out the front, because I've had that experience where I've tugged hard on a stubborn cut branch and just broken other branches, ones I was trying to save. You may come across a large branch that's living that needs to come out. If you come in from the top, the blade of the branch can potentially fall off before you've finished your cut. Rather than coming from the top with your handsaw and just cutting straight through, you make 3 separate cuts. Go out from the union, some inches, maybe even a foot, depending on the size of the branch, and make an undercut. And then you come and go even further out and cut from the top. What you've done is the end weight's going to pull the branch down, but it's going to meet that undercut kerf that you made and just snap off cleanly. And then the third cut is the finished cut. There's no weight here that's really going to tear back.
On these branches where you've got dead nubbins, is it good to take off the nubbins as well?
It is, unless that nub is all healed over.
Okay.
You're damaging the tree. Every time you break that outer bark barrier, you are basically opening up the tree to infection and disease potential. The reason you don't want to leave a nub or a stub is that's just that much more material that the tree has to grow out and over. Whenever a branch comes off of a bigger branch, it forms this ridge of cell growth called the branch bark collar. I can see it pretty clearly here. Right about in there, it's basically this kind of wrinkled collar area. The bark branch collar is a very important thing to look for. The tree has the best opportunity to close its wound over if you leave that collar there.
So when you're cutting off dead stuff like this,
It's
the same thing, you would cut back to the collar?
Yeah, I would. If you had a stub like that was clearly healed over,
Right.
I would just leave it alone. I wouldn't bother, because you're basically just reopening up another wound, and that wound response takes energy, and especially on an old tree, the last thing you want to do is make it expend any more energy than it has to. But I don't think this is alive. Right about, oh, it's totally gone.
That is really crisp.
Yeah. So with any luck, the tree will be able to grow over that. Right here is a great example of that wound closure response. There was a wound that the tree, this branch here, is trying to close over to seal itself off. That's essentially that branch bark collar wound enclosure structure right there. And inside that is just dead material. Looking at the interior of this tree, I wish we could see more of the 2 and main scaffolds. Maybe we can compromise and prune that particular thing up. There may be a way to save this and not make it look congested and in competition with the rest of the tree. in a year, if you decide that wasn't the right decision, you can always take it out later.
And keeping a living resource alive is very different than keeping a building standing upright. So we're very proud of the fact that the trees are doing as well as can be expected, and they are still producing fruit and flowers every year. They're a really important cultural resource that we're very proud to be protecting for future generations. And they are, as we say, the only truly Russian thing still here at Fort Ross.